Dr. Shweta Singhal would be talking about NMO and MOG related optic neuritis. Okay, no problem.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Shweta. I'm a consultant neuro-ophthalmologist from the Singapore National Eye Center. I also work as a clinician scientist at the Singapore Eye Research Institute, and I'm an assistant professor with the Duke NUS Medical School as well. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about our approach to optic neuritis, particularly the atypical optic neuritis, and how things have changed from the time of the days when multiple sclerosis was primarily the diagnosis when we were seeing patients with optic neuritis. And now with a lot of new markers coming in, the approach has changed. So this is how we tend to classify and approach our patients, and this is what I'd like to share with you. I have no financial interests here. So this is a typical atypical optic neuritis patient. Let's say we have a 39-year-old lady. She presents with a left-sided drop in vision for about 2 weeks. She has progressive visual loss, and she says it's painful, and she has pain on eye movement. So you expect to see these kinds of patients with optic neuritis, but the thing that's atypical here is the fact that her vision is very bad, so she can only count fingers at half a meter in her left eye. She can't see the test plates. She has a pretty significant RAPD, and the rest of the examination is normal. Her discs look pretty normal as well. There's not really any disc swelling. The fundus looks pretty okay. And when we do the visual field, we see that she has a pretty bad visual field. So her left eye can't really do any charting on the Humphreys. We tend to use Goldman a lot, and you can see that she has a central visual field defect in her left eye, which is pretty significant. The right eye looks okay. OCT doesn't really add much here. Everything looks pretty normal. So we're thinking something is going on either in the optic nerve, or we always keep in mind that the retina may be the culprit too. So you do OCT of the macula, that looks fine too. And then in summary, you have here a young patient, has a left painful optic neuropathy, anterior segment is normal, retina and optic nerve look normal as well. And we usually ask for additional neurological symptoms such as raised ICP, any neurological weakness, any preceding flu, history of cancer, ischemic risk factors. All of this seems negative. So you are all going to go ahead and do your neuroimaging, and you may find that there is some enhancement of the optic nerve. Over here you can see, so you can see that there's some enhancement of the optic nerve over here. You can see that over here as well. So you know this is optic neuritis, and based on what we have all followed all this while, we would do this. We would screen our patients for suitability of steroid treatment. We would look for the major infective causes that we want to make sure are not present in these patients, like TB or syphilis, and then we would always keep in mind multiple sclerosis. So this is just an example of the kind of screening we would do to rule out any underlying infections, and then we would go ahead and treat the patient with pulsed IV steroids, which is what the ONTT trial recommends. And what we would expect to see is if the patient is following what the ONTT recommends, which is that a combination of drugs gives you speedy recovery, which is IV MP plus oral methylprednisolone. The recovery of vision occurs with or without treatment. And yes, we are always thinking about MS, so white matter lesions will predict MS, and you look for that in your neuroimaging. But outcomes are generally favorable and stable. So that's fine when these patients respond to treatment well. But what happens if they don't? If there's a poor response and you've had to increase the dose of IVMP, or if you're considering plasmapheresis, what then? What is wrong with these patients? So if we go back to the eligibility criteria for the optic neuritis treatment trial, there's some things that we need to keep in mind. First, that the age range of that study was 18 to 46 years. They did include only unilateral optic neuritis. They excluded any other autoimmune conditions apart from multiple sclerosis or any other systemic diseases. So when we are applying these criteria to our patients, we need to know that not all patients will fall under this group, and therefore not all patients will react and respond the way the ONTT suggests they would. So what happens to the non-responders? Now in our center, and I think in a lot of places across the world, you will do an autoimmune screen. You will look for SLE, rheumatoid arthritis, Sjogren's, granulomatous polyangiitis, and antiphospholipid syndromes. But again, what happens if they're all negative? You're still left with a patient who has optic neuritis confirmed on MRI, but you don't know what is ahead for them. And that's where some of these other conditions come in. So neuromyelitis optica is a condition that's been known for a long time, but its relationship with optic neuritis has evolved over the years. And so it basically came about when we saw all these patients who did not fit the MS criteria, who had severe optic neuritis with or without spinal involvement. And their disease was lasting for a longer period of time than the ONTT suggested, and it was more severe disease. It was also affecting older patients. The ONTT age group of 18 to 46 was not applicable in these groups. And if you try to treat them with the multiple sclerosis medication like interferons, they either failed treatment or in fact had worse prognosis. So the identification of the aquaporin 4 antibody in 2004 changed things quite a bit, because all of these patients who weren't fitting the criteria then started testing positive for aquaporin 4 antibody. And now there is a good degree of evidence to explain what happens in these patients. But really for us, I think when we see these patients at the outset, it's to recognize that these patients might be NMO positive. And although there is a lot of literature out there, I just wanted to point out here that one key difference that I find clinically very useful is the length of involvement of the optic nerve on MRI. So there's a long length involvement of the optic nerve usually, as opposed to MS where you have focal enhancement. In NMO spectrum disease, you usually have a long segment of involvement, and it is usually more posterior and prechiasmatic in involvement. So these patients have retrobulbar optic neuritis usually, so the optic nerve looks normal, and it's because there is long segment involvement of the posterior optic nerve compared to MS. So as you can see in some example images here, this is taken from a review publication from neurology. Both the picture on the right, picture A, which shows you the long tract involvement of the posterior optic nerve on the right side, and picture B, which shows you bilateral involvement, which can also happen quite often in these patients. So if you see this on your MRI, even at the outset in your patients, you do want to think about the possibility that this is not MS and this is NMO, and then you may want to send for the test and think about prognosis accordingly. The other entity that then came about was similar in how aquaporin 4 came about, because a lot of groups who were NMO spectrum disease and had been categorized as NMO were testing negative for NMO. So they were being called NMO spectrum disease, but they were seronegative. And when the myelin oligodendrocyte antibody marker was discovered and established, it was found that 1/3 of patients who were negative for aquaporin 4 antibody were actually positive for this antibody. And they, again, had a different phenotype. They had a different presentation and prognosis. These were younger patients than you were seeing in NMO, but they were not MS patients. They usually had no preceding viral illness. They had no associated autoimmune conditions. And they usually, again, this is the key clinical feature that helps with the diagnosis when you see them at the outset, is that they would be bilateral usually. It's retrobulbar in the sense that the anterior optic nerve is involved on the MRI, but the disc is affected, so you would often see disc swelling in both eyes. Excuse me. So, for example, this patient, this is one of our patients, presented with bilateral optic neuropathy and disc swelling, where you note that the right disc is more swollen than the left. And if you look at the MRI, you see that the right optic nerve actually is much thicker than the left optic nerve. And it's the anterior optic nerve that's thicker. So that's why the right disc is swollen. But the left disc is involved as well. However, the involvement is more posterior. So if you see in the second image, the optic disc on the other side, which is intracanaliccular and intracranial optic nerve, is the one that's most affected. So there's a clear correlation in the part of the optic nerve that's involved and the appearance of the disc, but the take-home point here is that usually it's bilateral, and usually you will see this. You will see this. Very thick optic nerves and usually bilateral. These patients also present with headache sometimes, so they can present with a benign intracranial hypertension-like picture, but they have poor optic nerve function as you would expect in optic neuritis. So is it MS, is it NMO, or is it MOG? I think if we can make that difference clinically at the outset, it really would make a difference in the way we manage our patients. So the age group, NMO is the oldest age group. If you have younger patients, then you need to look at clinical criteria, but MS is still younger than the MOG group. MOG is also present in a lot of children, so that's a different category. I'm not talking about that too much today. And then the second key feature to keep in mind, like I said, is the bilaterality, which is more common in MOG. So what do we do with these patients? Now, if in our center, we actually test all patients who come with optic neuritis for both NMO antibody as well as MOG antibody once we have shown that the MRI has enhancement and we have confirmed that it is optic neuritis. If their vision is good, then we continue with the response as before. If their vision is poor, then we do consider plasmapheresis early because these patients have been shown to do well with this. What happens if the workup is negative? We look for autoimmune factors as well, and we work with our neurologist. But this is a situation when really one other thing that I would like to make a point here about is that we keep in mind a lot of these patients in the past were referred to as chronic relapse, chronic refractory inflammatory optic neuropathy. And that was basically a way of saying we don't know what's happening with these patients who have severe optic neuritis, who are negative for all the known markers in our armamentarium. And really, if you could take home this message, paraneoplastic optic neuritis is very, very common. It's often missed. So if you have patients who are presenting like this, they have severe optic neuritis, they don't respond to any treatment, they're negative for NMO and MOG, please do a whole body screen to see if there's any underlying cancer. There are panels for paraneoplastic antibodies available, but depending on the availability in your center, even the most basic cancer screen would be something you should do in these patients. So I'll just summarize here to say that ONTT had very specific inclusion criteria. So applying ONTT-based treatment should be done with caution in patients who are outside that age group and may have other autoimmune conditions. NMO spectrum disease and MOG should be looked at the outset in every patient with optic neuritis if your center allows it. Clues to NMO-SD is basically retrobulbar severe posterior optic nerve involvement. The disc may look normal. Clues to MOG are bilateral disc swelling with anterior optic nerve involvement. And please consider paraneoplastic workup in patients who are poor responders with negative MS, autoimmune, NMO, and MOG workup. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes. They do, yes. So not always, and we do look for it. We always go by clinical history, of course. If they have no signs and symptoms, they may not. Our neurology colleagues quite insist on a spinal MRI in every patient, but we have seen very little evidence that patients who are asymptomatic do have spinal involvement. So we would go by history as well. And then the other feature in these patients sometimes is they have the area postrema symptoms, so they may just come with vomiting and giddiness, and they may not have any other spinal symptoms. So, but that can be picked up on your MRI because you can see it on the brainstem.
Do you routinely do MRI of the spine in all patients?
No, we don't. Yeah, we go by clinical symptoms.
Yeah, it's NMO doesn't have a subclinical lesions what you get in MS, demyelinating subclinical lesions. If there is a spinal lesion, it would be symptomatic.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So any other questions from us? So we have an interesting patient, the pediatric age group, the aneurysm. We know the aneurysm is not common in pediatric age group. So whenever you get the aneurysm after an infective pathology like meningitis, orbitocellulitis, or an infective pathology of the face, and there the patient recovers, and then after again get the ophthalmoplegic features in the eye, then think that might be a mycotic aneurysm following that infective pathology. Because in our places also the radiologists were also not sure that's a mycotic aneurysm, and I was worried why the patient already improved with the antibiotic treatment. Again, there's a recurrence of ophthalmoplegia. And then I told them, is it possibility that mycotic aneurysm? Then they said, okay, let's study it again. And they said it's a mycotic aneurysm. It's a give a trial of antibiotic, but most of them they respond to antibiotic and they resolve. Some of them they need intervention, what we explained. And so it's very important clinically examine the patient and discuss the cases with neuroradiologists, because sometimes they don't get a good idea of clinical and whatever they see the radiology and they give the diagnosis. So if we go and discuss with them, tell them there's a clinical pathology and we are suspecting it is over here is it there or not, why it is happening, then they can give you a better diagnosis and they can help you out. Aneurysm, yeah, following a trauma, basal fracture of the skull. Patient, pseudoaneurysm patient that, but they again did the neuro intervention to that patient. Yeah, the stent procedure, and the coiling is slightly risky because they have a thin wall. It is a hematoma which resolves, and it is a fibrous wall. And since it's a communicating, because there is a breach in the ICA because of the basal fracture of the skull. So there's a breach, but it is not that big. It will cause a lot of the slow oozing of the blood into the sphenoid sinus. And that hematoma, that would be hematoma, which is also, it is in continuity with the ICA, so it remains. So it's a pseudoaneurysm, doesn't have the wall. And secondly, because of the thin wall, they have a tendency to rupture, and massive bleed and mortality is also known. So it's very important to diagnose this condition. Suspicion of index is important. And secondly, whenever you get a case of a fracture of the skull, which is with a problem with traumatic eye injury and traumatic optic neuropathy, but when there is a haziness in the sphenoid sinus, keep this patient for follow-up, because this haziness might be a blood into the sphenoid sinus, which may resolve and form a pseudoaneurysm. So it's important to keep on following this patient with us for some time. Yeah.
So there was one child in your presentation who had who was treated initially as meningitis,
Yeah, yeah.
and then subsequently when the meningitis recovered, the aneurysm was discovered.
Yeah, it was discovered.
Discovered,
Then he
yeah.
presented with external ophthalmoplegia to us.
Yeah. So could it have been that actually the patient was having leak from the blood from the aneurysm and actually was having meningism and not meningitis? Was it a proved case of meningitis?
At
Was
that
IV
time, it was not. At that time, the imaging was done, it was normal. There was no aneurysm at all.
Yeah, imaging was shown. Meningitis was there 1 month back, and there was a imaging CT scan. I think it was there, so that was normal at that time.
So the clinical examination is still important, just not make a diagnosis on neuroimaging, because we had one patient who had a third nerve palsy and it was known diabetic. And the patient, when I got the MRI done, they reported it's normal. But the patient, when came on follow-up, he had a V1 involvement, the loss of sensation in the V1 area also. So I went again and I said, you said it's a normal MRI, but patient symptoms are increasing. So you please again review your MRI and just suggest. So it's very important, go back and talk to them, tell them your clinical finding, tell them your clinical suspicion about the diagnosis, then they can analyze the imaging proper. So he said, okay, then he reviewed it again. He said, yeah, now I can think there's a slight thickening of the paranasal sinuses wall and even the cavernous sinus wall. So it is possible patient is a diabetic also. It might be a fungal infection. So not necessarily fungal infection will result in the filling of the sinuses. It may just result into the thickening of the mucosa. And when we got the endoscopic biopsy done by ENT surgeon, it turned out to be a fungal hyphae. And we treated the patient on antifungal, now good antifungal voriconazole and all, patient resolved. So that is important, to when we see the symptoms are increasing, go back, discuss with them, because imaging is not the one which will make diagnosis. A clinical plus imaging is important in neuro-ophthalmology. Yeah.
An 8-year-old girl, sometimes, who has been having persistent transient loss of vision since age 3. General examination was normal. We did an MRI, we did blood investigation, there was nothing detected. But this girl, sometimes for about 15 minutes, she will be blind.
Okay.
Then it started increasing, sometimes up to an hour. After that, she will be okay. She will be normal. So we are confused. What could have been responsible for this? It's an 8-year-old, obscuration of vision initially, then up to 30 minutes, sometimes an hour. Sometimes we'll be going on the road. I want to cross the road, and she will be blind. She will need to be helped out of the road and taken back home. So we couldn't get any physical finding that could be suggestive. MRI was normal, so we were all confused. We didn't know what was wrong with this young girl.
Okay. It was a bilateral patient was getting the visual loss, or it was a unilateral?
Bilateral.
Bilateral. So definitely the vestibular, their vertebral system pathology must be there because of the bilateral. So we should get the MR angio done in this patient, and cardiac examination also important.
Cardiac is
There
important,
might
yeah.
be some cardiac pathology would be there, not necessarily the neurological cause would be there.
What about the recurrent ophthalmoplegia with normal MRI? Recurrent ophthalmoplegia responding to steroid, but again getting recurrence, and MRI is normal.
Yeah, that would be a Tolosa-Hunt syndrome patients, So definitely we have to give
Get
the
a,
steroid to them.
get a further more
And do they
finer
give-
sections.
Do they give a good response on steroid within 24 hours of treatment?
No, this time response is not that weak. It
Okay.
is gradual. Diplopia is not
Gradual.
reducing, but patient is feeling comfortable.
Comfortable.
Age?
Okay.
Age
Is it
55.
MRI is absolutely normal? Did you discuss with the because pachymeningitis is another condition where you can get this type of ophthalmoplegia responding to the steroid. So
This was seen by
immunosuppression.
neurologist also.
Okay.
Even test for myasthenia were also done.
Okay.
But
Okay.
it is normal.
And patient doesn't have any systemic disease.
The anticholinesterase antibody. No, that was not.
A therapeutic trial to anti-myasthenic medication is also one of this. Neostigmine trial is also one of the way of diagnosing these cases. Or sometimes ocular myasthenia cases also are refractory to the treatments.
Much. Thank you.
After the starting of the symptoms, we give the pulse steroid. Means it will be effective in certain period of time. It will not be effective after certain time.
Usually the resolution always starts occurring after a period of 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks. But if the patient is coming after 6 weeks and already recovering, then I don't think there's a sense. Within first 2 weeks, if you can give, whether you give or not, usually it recovers. It's only hasten the recovery and preventing the recurrences of attacks, that's whether the first 2 years. So the role of steroid is there. The patient is coming you after a period of 3 to 4 weeks, already showing some improvement. I don't think this is giving a steroid. Within first 2 weeks, it's a patient is coming, then you can give steroid.
Ma'am, I had a case. I was just yesterday. I'm still in the process of investigating. So there's a middle-aged man who just came with had headache. So just came for a routine eye examination. The only other positive finding was like slight bagginess of the cheeks, which could have been an allergy. And so when I was seeing his fundus and all, the thing which stood out, there was bilateral, this swelling, papilledema. The stark thing about it, it was very well circumscribed. Very high edema, but extremely well circumscribed with a few hemorrhages. So I just wanted to ask, he's gone for his investigations, that what are the entities that cause a very circumscribed type of papilledema as opposed to a very widespread sort of papilledema? It might help me in my...
I don't think any circumscribed papilledema.
Edema
Papilledema
is-
is papilledema. And when you see a massive papilledema, and how was the visual acuity of the patient?
Visual acuity is 618, 612,
So
nothing
it's a
extraordinary.
decreased. Visual acuity has decreased.
Decreased, but,
the best corrected vision was 618, 612.
Yeah, about
So
6.
and how long the history is there?
Just 15 days, and in fact, I've just sent him for urgent investigations.
And he's a
all
male
that.
patient, male
he's a male
patient.
patient, fit. He's physically very fit and all that. I didn't do the color vision that time because there was no RAPD and all that. Just I happened to discover this
There was
because
no RAPD.
he had that astigmatic type of mixed astigmatism type of refractive error. So I said I'll just dilate you so that I can get a better this thing. And then I just discovered this severe papilledema, but extremely well circumscribed, you know, like you have a drusen of the optic nerve head. But this was very, very high with hemorrhages.
With such a short history, with such a massive papilledema, with the decrease in the vision, I would think venous sinus thrombosis or venous sinus pathology, narrowing, a hypertrophic retinoid granulation, they may cause such a rapid increase in the ICP. That one pathology. So MRV with contrast, you should get it done, and hemogram and other things should be done.
So hemorrhages were there in the fundus? No.
No, not in the rest of the fundus,
And how
only
about
within that
Around the disc.
circumscribed.
Around the disc, no hemorrhage.
Only
And-
one tiny one. One tiny one.
What about the fields of the patient?
So he had to get fields done. He'll get it done tomorrow. He was saying right now. Yeah. So it's
Oh,
just
okay.
under investigation.
Yeah.
The only other thing I was thinking was an infiltrative kind of thing, you know, like you get in myeloid thing, and I was thinking this might be that myeloid facies or something. Of course, that was a very
Hemorrhages would be much
far-fetched.
more extensive because the hemorrhagic retinopathy, which causes this infiltrative pathology. So hemorrhages would be much more extensive, but there is not many hemorrhages, but edema was
Only
much more
one
marked.
tiny one separately.
Yeah.
But within
So
that circumscribed
myeloid,
thing was hemorrhages. Within
myeloid-
that thing, there were a lot of hemorrhages within that circumscribed thing.
Over the disc, hemorrhages
Over
were
the
massive.
disc. But the stark thing was the fabulous circumscribed thing. You know, it was so well
Infiltrative
circumscribed.
pathology might be one
Can be
cause,
there.
you know.
Yeah, can be there.
Yeah, can be there.
So well circumscribed. I wish I had got it along to show you. I mean, you know.
infiltrative
Infiltrative,
pathology can be
infiltrative can be
there.
there then. If it is well circumscribed.
Right. Thank you.
Okay.
I think now we can just come to the end of the session and the next speaker they can just take over. मैंने sign वाइन मार दिया आपके ये feedback from the
अच्छा अच्छा ओके ओके कर दिया ना तुमने